My name is Frieda Sorber. I used to be curator of the historical collection at the Fashion Museum in Antwerp, and I've been interested in lace most of my life. I went to an exhibition on lace when I was 13 years old in Antwerp and decided that I wanted to make lace myself, and that is what got me into it, because I taught myself by looking at older pieces of lace and trying to figure out how they were made. By the time I was 22, I started my museum career and was of course very happy to find that same collection that I had found when I was a 13-year-old. And by that time I knew nothing, and now we're 45 years later and I still feel like I know nothing, but it's an endlessly interesting subject. Lace is very interesting because it consists of two very separate techniques, bobbin lace and needle lace, and both came about at the very end of the 15th century. And by now I am convinced that both originated in Italy. But by the 1550s, lace was being made in Antwerp, and Antwerp probably has the oldest records, business records, about the making and the selling of lace. The early lace usually has a geometric pattern, and this is a very typical late 16th century, early 17th century example that shows you a combination of needle lace, this part, and bobbin lace, the edging. Is a technique with bobbins made on a pillow, so it's a kind of braiding technique, but it becomes very intricate. The needle lace was made on a temporary support, as you can see here. So you have a parchment, you have two layers of fabric, there's a design on the parchment, and you basically do embroidery on the parchment, but you also always stay on top of the parchment, so when the piece is ready, you can separate the layers and you have a piece of, as they called it in Italy, punto in aere, because it looks like it has been made in the air. Both techniques evolve very, very quickly, and skipping many stages, by the mid-17th century, Antwerp plus a large surrounding area would make lace like this here. So you can see the threads have become much finer, and the designs in the mid-17th century are normally very dense. So you can, if you look very closely at this kind of cabbage motif, which was probably intended to be a peony, there's a tree in here, and sometimes in the tree there's little birds, and there's very stylized birds in these sections. This lace became very popular in large parts of Europe, so you can really find it from Southern Europe all the way to the Scandinavian countries, and also all the way to Eastern Europe. It is very hard to figure out where exactly these pieces were made, because especially in the beginning, most lace centers in Europe did very similar things. And with new scientific methods, we're just starting to try and figure out if technologically or chemically we can find differences in different production centers. Antwerp became so well known for these types of laces that people from all over Europe would come to Antwerp to learn about lace and lace making. But of course fashions evolved quickly, so in the second half of the 17th century the lace becomes more open, as you can see in these pieces. These pieces are exceptional because they have actually human figures worked in them. This has always been done. The oldest pieces that have this These figurative representations were already there in the late 16th century, but in the 17th century this really blossoms. Now Antwerp kind of starts to lose its position as a lace-making center throughout the 18th century. And when we move to the first third of the 18th century, we end up with pieces like this. So this piece, they are lappets which were used in several ways to decorate bonnets or to just use in the intricate 18th century hairdos. And we are very lucky to not only have pieces, and here you can see how extremely fine the lace thread has become by that time. We call it Mechlin because of the ground, the main ground, so the transparent bit between the designs. These two are definitely not high fashion. They were serving niche markets, and they were still influenced by the 17th century design. The peony here has evolved to something a bit more open. The lace has become wider, and when I look at where in Europe that type of lace would have been used, everything is pointing towards Leeuwarden, Friesland, in the north of Holland. The other piece is the scalloped one, is also heavily influenced by the 17th century. You can see the lace thread is much coarser than it would be in this example or even in that one. And that type of lace was used for the Middle and South American market. And we know from archives that certainly from the mid-17th century onwards, thousands and thousands of ells of lace were shipped from Antwerp over Ostend, from Ostend to Cadiz and in Spain, and from Cadiz to Havana, Cuba, and from Cuba they would go overland to Mexico, all the way to Chile and Peru. So this is a really fascinating story, and those South Americans, they always wanted these scalloped laces. That type of design had a lot of influence in South America, and you can see the influence in textiles, like in tapestries they did in Peru and Bolivia. You can see the influence in their architecture, where they use these scallop designs on, in painting on buildings and in frescoes. So it had a very wide influence, which usually in Western Europe isn't very well known. But it's lovely to see these commercial ties, and it's lovely to read about them because there's a lot of business correspondence left. Often business correspondence in many languages, which makes it hard to decipher, because when you find a business correspondence about lace in Antwerp can easily be in 6-7 languages. And then it's in an old type of that language, so it's not always easy to interpret.